sex worker advocacy groups are worried about the safety of workers after the discovery of 6 decomposed bodies at a Johannesburg workshop. Several sex workers in the Johannesburg inner city have gone missing since the beginning of this year. Joining us to unpack this disturbing story is Dr. Gerard Labuschagne, former SAPS head profiler. A very good afternoon to you, Dr. Labuschagne. Thank you for your time. Perhaps as we get started with our conversation, as you may have been watching the developments within the media space, what have you made of this case? 6 bodies in a decomposing state found at this workshop in the Joburg CBD. What have your assessments been from the outside?
Well, obviously, when you find a number of bodies at once, you have to first determine, whether, is this a criminal act, or is this, for example, like we saw in that tavern down the Eastern Cape, where people died as a result of sort of external circumstances that weren't criminal in nature. And I think this is pretty much looking like a criminal act. The next issue is, were they all murdered separately or at once? Was it a mass murder versus a serial murder? And it's looking like the possibility that this particular case could be serial. If these are indeed sex workers. Interestingly enough, in South Africa, sex workers aren't really commonly the victims of serial murderers. They are the victims of many other crimes by clients and the police themselves, but they're not typically the victimology of actual serial murderers in South Africa. But it does seem as if this has a potential to be a serial. It sounds like the very last victim was seen alone with him, which then separates her incident from the other person's potential murders. I do know that they have the right sort of people involved in trying to identify the bodies, which allows them to then trace their last movements, their identities, etc. And that's going to be very crucial. The police's victim identification center, I do believe my old unit is involved to some degree in this process. So it sounds like they're really putting the right resources into this particular case.
Now, Sisonke National Sex Worker Movement, the organization was also part of those who are weighing in on this matter as the suspect appeared in court. They're saying that, a lot of workers, alleged sex workers, have gone missing this year. Families and colleagues have managed to identify some of those bodies found in the Joburg CBD. The bodies are said to, of course, be in a decomposing state. Is this an indication of how long they could have been there for?
Look, it depends. The temperatures now are quite high, so bodies do decompose very quickly. We don't know if it was in a hot, closed environment, which would compound the decomposition. So we have to be very careful to assume that decomposition means that they were there for weeks, or days, or months, etc. And if they are very decomposed, family might be able to identify victims on clothing, maybe if there's an ID book, etc. But ultimately, if there's a lot of decomposition, which I don't know the extent in this particular case, one would really want to use DNA or dentistry to try and identify exactly who these people are, because visual identification can become very difficult in those circumstances. So yes, I think what the police should be doing is going through missing persons reports, approaching sex workers, asking them to come forward with the names of people who have just disappeared, and they can try and marry those two and then forensically confirm them to make sure we have identified who these individuals are. If anything, for their loved ones to be informed. It's not necessary to identify a person to obtain a conviction in court, but it definitely helps investigators perhaps link this person if we know that on that day she went missing from this particular premises where she might have been a sex worker. It makes it easier to try and link him to that particular incident.
Now, Dr. Labuschagne, much of your experience is in the field of investigating psychologically motivated crimes like serious sex offences, murders, stalking and the likes. What we know about the case so far is that a 20-year-old suspect has been linked to only one of the victims. Sex workers say they're now living in fear and they believe they are being targeted in Johannesburg. Of course, there's still a lot of grey area. What would you say is particularly striking about this case?
Well, as I said earlier, sex workers are targeted on a regular basis by their clients who abuse them, police that abuse them, and other people that abuse them. So in general, there are definitely people who are prone to being attacked. Now, as I said earlier, they're not typically the victims of serial murders in South Africa, and that has a lot to do with our economic circumstances, which of course doesn't mean that this isn't a serial case. It just means they're not typically the victims of serial murderers. I do think that a lot of issue has been made about the fact that he's only been linked to one. Remember, this case was only discovered, I think, on Monday. And he was pretty much immediately identified as a potential suspect. So it's very common in those circumstances, before you've done your thorough, complete investigation, to only charge the person on one case, just to get him on the case roll, just to arrest him, just to keep him in prison awaiting trial, while the rest is finalized. So that doesn't mean that later on he isn't going to be charged when we actually go to trial with perhaps even more murders than these particular ones, if we perhaps find out that he might have been linked to the disappearance of other ladies beyond the 6 who are found there. So I don't think people should be up in arms, or sex worker organizations should be angry that why isn't he charged with all 6. That's more just to do with where we are in the investigation. And if you charge someone with the other 5 murders, and at this point there's no actual evidence against him on those 5, because there probably wouldn't be much, you're on the risk of the case being thrown out. So having one pretty solid one that he's linked to, just to keep him in custody, normal procedure, not to worry, and it doesn't mean that he's not going to be charged with a lot more other crimes than potentially even just the 6. So we can't assume that these 6 are the only victims.
Yeah.
A proper serial investigation would have to look into his whereabouts, the places he visits, how many sex workers are missing from those particular places that he perhaps visited, not just maybe the one establishment where these ones might have come from, if they're all from one. And that really is a proper serial investigation to find the full extent of where he might have been operating. So you'd want to go to his house, search through his cell phone, search through items that he might have kept as souvenirs at his place of residence that could link us to other potential victims. So there's a lot of work that the investigators still have to do if they're doing a proper serial investigation.
It's also since emerged that the 20-year-old suspect who appeared in court yesterday was charged with rape last year, but the victim withdrew the case in February. There's also suggestions that there are many complaints made by some sex workers about this suspect. Do these suggestions, allegations bring us any closer to perhaps getting a picture of understanding who exactly the suspect is and what the motive may be?
Absolutely. And again, a good serial investigation, if they're following the guidelines that exist within the police about conducting serial investigations, they're making good use of my old unit's members who have worked on countless serial cases to assist them and guide them, and they're not trying to be heroes and do this investigation without any external support. They would be exploring all those issues. They would be exploring that old rape case that was withdrawn. I would definitely go to that victim and say, look, he's now arrested for something more serious. Because, we know that the rape attrition case, the attrition rate for rape cases is very high. Something like, I think, less than 8% that are opened up at the police ever end up with a conviction. So it doesn't mean that because that case was withdrawn that the victim wasn't actually raped. So I would go back to that victim, re-interview her, ask if she wants to go ahead with the case, because now, if she felt, well, this is going to be a he said, she said, but now you're adding that rape case to a bunch of murdered cases, it's really going to bolster each other. And all these other, informal concerns that have been raised, informally, not necessarily to the police, you would really want now for those investigators to say to all these sex workers at these organizations, come forward to us if you have any information about an incident with this guy. Even if you're not going to charge him on those, you start to build a better psychological picture of the nature of this person, their motives, etc., which is always going to help when you're interviewing. And I really do hope that the detectives have gotten the right advice before they interview the suspect, because this is not your normal suspect. You want to interview this person very carefully, with guidance from the investigative psychology section, to make sure that you can try and get as much information out of him. Because if you interview him properly, he might tell you more about what happened, where potential other victims might be. And that's essential in this type of case. You cannot just go at it alone. You really want those experts that are in there in the police still to guide and assist this investigation. In fact, the police, South African police, is the only organization in the world that has ministerial approved guidelines for how to conduct serial investigations. And I really hope that the investigators dealing with this are following those guidelines, because that will help them a lot in knowing the way forward for this case.
So what line of questioning would that entail, besides what we see in the movies?
Well, I don't want to give away all of our tips and secrets about how we approach suspects, but definitely not just asking about the incidences. You want to get to know this individual, so you have to do your background information first. Go to his house, see what's there, what are the kind of things he's interested in, speak to fellow friends and co-workers, speak to these other sex workers that have interacted with him before you approach him, so that you're approaching him with a much better understanding of at least maybe his interests, who he is, what kind of a person, and from the sex worker's side, what is this guy's sexual fantasies or interests, that when we move into this interview of him, you're going to be in a far better status to actually get as much information from him and to get his cooperation than if you do it wrongly. You're just going to get a guy who's going to shut down and say, I'm not prepared to speak to you.
Mm-hmm. Some of the reaction that we also saw outside of court yesterday, a representative from the Sex Workers Education and Advocacy Task Force saying that she was aware that at least 3 sex workers from the Joburg CBD area had been reported missing from as far back as July this year, adding that at least 2 other sex workers had been murdered within that same month, with their bodies found in a separate place. I think it was in Joburg Park, a hotel room in the inner city. I mean, without preempting anything, could this trend bear the hallmarks of a serial killer specifically targeting sex workers at all?
Yeah, like I said, these 6 potentially sound like we could be dealing with a serial with this young guy that was arrested. But, my personal view is that, sex work, any crimes against sex workers should be specifically investigated by a specialized team of detectives, because they are always vulnerable to, as I said, abuse by law enforcement and other people. Like I said, historically, they haven't been typically the victims of sex workers, although we have had although we have had sex worker series throughout the country. So, we typically say that your serial murders are sexually motivated crimes. So the rape and murder of any woman should be considered as potential serial until it's investigated and proved otherwise. So yes, of course. And I do think, like I said, they are extremely vulnerable population. And I worked, after I left the police, another case where a very brave young sex worker came forward and said, I was raped by this guy. My family knows what work I do, so I'm not embarrassed about this coming out, and I know this guy needs to be prosecuted. And we knew from her own interactions with about 10 other sex workers that this guy had also raped them. But to get them, unfortunately, to come forward and proceed with giving evidence in court is very difficult. In that particular case, we went from potential 10 victims down to that one brave lady who did testify about this guy, and he was convicted. So there's a lot of mistrust, understandably, by sex workers towards the police, and that's, again, why you would need to have detectives who really understand what they're dealing with and know how to approach this vulnerable group of people who are regularly abused and don't trust the police, to make sure that they're going to want to come forward. And you might find that once you get the trust of 1 or 2, that they believe that you are interested in helping them, you're probably going to find that will ripple effect, and you'll find other ones coming forward through word of mouth. And that's, again, why you really want serial murder investigators who are trained and experienced in this field doing this, and people who have the sensitivity to understand that you're dealing with an incredibly vulnerable group of people in our society.
Yeah, an incredibly vulnerable group of people who also don't want their families to know about the line of work that they're doing. And I suppose that this gruesome discovery has now reignited calls for government to legalize sex work. With your vast experience on workplace violence, how much of an impact could the law have in ensuring that workers are protected and perhaps even recognized as workers?
We all have different views on sex work. Is it right, wrong, morally? The reality is it exists, and it's illegal now, but it's existing and it's carrying on and thriving. So I think that one way to try and make it safer for people doing this type of work, the government can get taxes, is to actually just go ahead and legalize it, have certain controls over it to some degree, and bring these people from out of the shadows and into the sort of legitimate world. And that takes part of the threat or abuse by police members for, I'm going to lock you up if you don't, satisfy me in some kind of a way, or people that are abusing them. If they feel that actually this is a legally recognized job, therefore I can go to the police. I don't have to worry about threats of people, reporting me to the police or arresting me. So I do think it is the way forward. I think it's a responsible thing to do. I know a lot of people are going to say on moral grounds that shouldn't happen, but that unfortunately doesn't address the reality of what's taking place on the streets for a large portion of our population who, again, don't want to necessarily be sex workers, but that's unfortunately where their lives have taken them to.
Very well. Thank you so much for that unpacking of this very disturbing story. Dr. Gerard Labuschagne, former SAPS head profiler, speaking about the 6 decomposed bodies found in the Johannesburg CBD.